Right. Good morning again and welcome back. It was a bit of a, I would call a lightning tea break, but I hope you're refreshed. You've gotten something just to, bring back the energy, ready for session 2 as well. And I think we'd all agree that really the first session was absolutely powerful. And I'm quite sure that each of us are now challenged within ourselves to show up bolder, braver, and more courageous in our personal lives, but even more so in the corporate spaces that we occupy. Just a couple of reminders as well. Please don't forget, if you are tweeting, the hashtag is hashtag DiveIn2020 or hashtag Braver Cultures as well. I think there was so many what I would call tweetable quotes that came out from the first session. So feel free to use them and let us flood the Twitter streets. And of course, don't forget, it's Dive In Fest on Twitter and Instagram, and at Dive In Festival on LinkedIn. And of course, don't forget that even as we continue with our second session, which I believe will be just as powerful, please continue to use the chat box. Let's continue to interact. Post your comments, your impressions, as well as your questions there, which I will then curate when we get to the Q&A session. Now, the first session that Dr. Margie Warrell led really, I believe, set us so well. Had a lovely segue into where we're going into now. You know, when you speak about boldness and courage, in fact, I saw somebody write in the chat earlier on when the question was asked, what would you want to do, or what would you need to do to be bolder, to be braver? And someone said, I want to be able to speak. I want to be able to share my thoughts and opinions in public, in meetings, in boardrooms. And, one of the biggest fears, I mean, that people have is a fear of speaking. And I think, and I'm so excited as well about this next session, because that's going to just really touch on those elements to say, how do we show up in corporate spaces? How do we ensure that we have the courage, the boldness, and the bravery to raise our voices, make them be heard, and to contribute to whatever discussions are happening in our spaces. Now, the next speaker that I'm going to introduce is Zoya Mabuto-Mokoditoa. She is the founder and MD of Zoya Speaks. As the name would suggest, obviously, she's a professional speaker, corporate MC, facilitator, and coach. Her areas of focus are leadership development, change management, as well as personal mastery, in addition to a litany of others. I've just summarized them for the purposes of this introduction. But she's had extensive speaking as well as facilitation engagements, both locally and abroad. She's a TED speaker and 2-time public speaking and evaluation champion for Southern Africa Toastmasters. Now, in my engagement with Zoya during the weekend, I can attest to the fact that she is passionate about her subject matter. And any conversation she enters into, she brings in the energy, empathy, but as well as a thorough subject knowledge, as well as strong interpersonal skills as well. And one interesting thing Zoya said to me yesterday, she said to me, Nico, thank you so much. All of these accolades that you've mentioned, yes, they are real, they are true, that's who I am, but I'm also a corporate dropout. And then my jaw dropped. I thought, what on earth does that mean, Zoya? But I think as to when she comes on, she'll tell us exactly what that means and how that has positioned her to really be able to contribute to this, to this discussion that we are having this morning. So Zoya will be speaking on building braver cultures where all our voices are heard. Zoya, over to you.
Woo! Thank you so much, Nico, for that wonderful introduction. I think we really have kick-started the session powerfully. Really enjoyed listening to Margie and the insights that she shared. I also noted there was some correlation between the content you said and some of what I'm going to cover. And of course, we know, ladies and gents, that what gets repeated gets remembered. And so as I revisit some of the concepts that have already been shared, I think for me it's to say we really want you to leave the session empowered with new knowledge or reminded of some of the knowledge that you already have. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you. Really a great opportunity I don't take for granted. I reflect often on how, the COVID pandemic, whilst it has had, its challenges, has also given us a number of gifts. And, those gifts include being able to be in this conversation with as many people as, have joined, that we're able to reach a lot more audiences having meaningful conversations. Another gift is just really appreciating when people make the time to connect. So I don't take it for granted. I really am honored to be able to do this work and to share some of the work that I do with you this morning. So I want to start by saying, sanibonani. Sanibonani, and I'm going to explain a little bit later why it's important for me to acknowledge or to greet you in that way. I'll explain what it means to those who are living outside of South Africa or the African continent. But let me start by going into the sort of, my corporate journey. And in particular, the reason I call myself a corporate dropout. It's a term I use frequently. I say I am a corporate dropout. And this is because I spent 10 years desperately trying to climb that corporate ladder. And I failed dismally. I remember, very specifically when I made the decision to leave corporate, really kind of being aware of how I had moved from being somebody who was quite confident and how over the years something had changed. My self-confidence had certainly deteriorated. My self-esteem was not what it used to be. And I remember specifically leaving the corporate environment feeling, drained, feeling dejected. I was down in the dumps when I made the decision to drop out. And, in the years that followed that, and in reflecting on the decision to drop out of corporate, I realized that it was connected to feelings of I've lost my voice. I felt as though somewhere along the line, I'd lost my voice. And how this translated in behavior was I would sit in a meeting and I would be thinking something. I'd want to contribute, but for some reason, I would hold back. And so, here I was, this person with great ideas, touted often as having, tons of potential. Zoya, you have great potential, but for some reason, not being able to fully realize that potential. And so my work really is around realizing, the value of creating environments that enable people's voices to be heard. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that. We're going to be talking about my experiences. I certainly also want you to dig deep into your own experiences as we think about building braver cultures. And so I'm going to ask your permission just to share my screen, and we're going to have a bit of fun together. Okay, perfect. Nico, if you can just confirm that you can see everything.
Yes, Zoya, affirmative.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And so when I started, I said I wanted to use an African term to kickstart, to get us into the session. And the African word I used was sanibonani. And of course, sanibonani is the plural derived from this word that you're seeing on screen, sawubona. Now, sawubona is from the Zulu language. So this is one of the languages that we speak here in South Africa. And, literal translation is I see you, but actually we use this to greet people. So it's saying hello, sawubona, hello. But when we translate this, literally, what do these words actually mean? The translation becomes I see you. When you say sawubona as you're greeting a person, I think what you're doing is that you're acknowledging that as you look at that person, they come into existence in your world and you in their world. I'm going to repeat that as you're saying hello to somebody, you're looking at that person. What happens is a beautiful exchange where they come into existence in your world and you in their world. And so in seeing each other, something starts to happen where we become connected, we become one. And I think it's important to really kind of kickstart in this way because if we think about it, if we think about the topic that we're going to be discussing today, it is about this concept around the willingness to truly see each other as human beings. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they said something quite powerful. They said, diversity is a fact. This was part of my research leading up to the session. Diversity is a fact. We're different, and we're different in so many ways. But they then went further and they said, but inclusion is a choice. We decide if we want to include people. Inclusion is a choice. We've got to make the decision to say, in the midst of this diversity, what are the ways in which we can be deliberate to include people? And Sawubona for me is such a critical starting point. The idea that somebody actually starts to come into existence for you. You see them and they see you. And so I wanted to explore this concept of brave cultures. I was asking the question, what do we mean when we're talking about building braver cultures or building brave cultures? And I think for me, I came across a beautiful quote in a book by Daniel J. Boorstin, and the book is titled The Discoverers. And he says something along the lines of, the world remains a boundless stage for discoveries to come. And he says the most important roads ever written on the maps of human experience are terra incognita. Now, if you don't know the words terra incognita, neither did I. I had to look this up. And in fact, the words terra incognita mean territory unknown. Because when we speak of brave cultures, I want to believe that we're largely chartering. We're going into a space that may feel unknown to some of us. What does it mean to build a culture that is brave? And so in exploring this for myself a little bit, I think I said, a brave culture could look like a place where we're willing to try approaches or methods or ways of doing things that may not have been done before. I think what it also suggests to me is, embarking on new paths, forging new ones potentially as well. And I think when we think about this concept of terra incognita, unknown territory or territory unknown, we realize that we can also make new discoveries when we decide to forge new ways. When we try out different things or new ways of doing things, we can also make new discoveries. And I think for me, this presents us with a reality that is both scary and exciting. To try something unknown, to go a route that's never been explored before, can be somewhat daunting, whilst it is exciting at the same time. I also think brave cultures will look like workplaces that make a genuine commitment to hear the many voices of their employees. And really, this is kind of my passion point, where I say, how do we create environments where people's voices are heard? And I'm going to share a little bit about the research we conducted in this effect. And I'm also going to engage with you around your own experiences. And so, maybe let's start with just hearing from you. And I'm going to ask you to actually go to Mentimeter for us. And I want to ask you the question, is being heard important to you? I'm quickly going to switch screens. I want to see the results. So if you can please go to www.menti.com, and I want you to use the code that's on the screen, and you're going to respond to the question, is being heard important to you? If we say building braver cultures is about the kind of workplaces that enable people's voices to be heard, does this even matter? And we're going to watch the results as they come through. And we'll give it another few seconds. But we're seeing that for the most part, the results are telling us that this is something that matters to us. And it almost feels like an obvious, right? That most people will say, look, for the most part, I want to be heard. We see a couple of maybes. There's one or two people, who are saying, look, for me, it's neither here nor there. And I'm curiously kind of wondering, for the person who says, look, it's not important for me to be heard, what the reasons there for that would be. So I'm going to just quickly switch back to the other screen. And in fact, what we're seeing, based on your responses is very similar to what we saw when we asked, a same question when we conducted the research. And so the feedback we got in our research was that, more than 90% of the people, and I think it correlates what we see, on the screen based on your responses. More than 90% of the people we were interviewing, doing focus groups with, etc., said to us, look, this thing of being heard is important. And a couple of people said, look, maybe. And there were various reasons for that as well. And it was interesting because we then asked them the follow-on question, those of you who say you want to be heard, tell us why this is important to you. And they shared a couple of things. They said, look, it's because I want to show up with confidence. Others said, I want to be able to influence my team. And this was interesting, where people said things like, I believe that I could influence my team. I could take them from one direction and steer them in another direction. Other people said, I actually want to contribute to my team's success. And this was such a powerful insight again, because we realized that, we don't look at employees as people who kind of want to come to work and not be productive. Our employees are telling us that they want to come to work for the purposes of contributing to the success of the teams that they find themselves in. People like to be affiliated with organizations that are successful, and they want to contribute to that success. Others said, I wanted to become a leader and be seen as one by others. And again, here, we know that when people raise their hand, when people share their ideas, when people challenge, there is correlation between that and our perceptions of them as leaders. And so those who communicate, those who contribute their ideas are typically perceived or seen by others as leaders. And so people said, I want to become a leader and be seen as one by others. And finally, we also heard that people said, when people hear me, it translates to so much more. It translates to feelings of being valued and appreciated. It says that I matter in this organization or in this team. People appreciate that I have value to contribute. And so we asked another question, because we got curious about all of this, these findings that people were sharing with us and the insights that were being generated as a result of the research. And so the question we then asked them was, but do you feel heard? So on the one hand, you think being heard is important, but let's just engage around, do you actually feel heard? And the specific framing of our research was, in the workplace, do you feel heard? And so I'm going to ask you to do the exact same thing, go onto Mentimeter, and let's have you respond to the second question around, do you feel heard? Okay, let's go back here. Okay, another few minutes to get a sense of what's happening there. Okay, and I'm going to close this, and I love that, we're sitting more at sometimes, because in our research, and this was done across, a diversity of sectors, we had diversity in terms of age, diversity in terms of race and gender. So we had all kinds of diversity represented there. And our findings were interesting, where many people responded that they, in fact, do not feel heard. Now, we conducted this research prior to the COVID pandemic, and I'm almost wondering if there's been a shift in terms of how our organizations are doing things. But I also appreciate that, some people say, look, sometimes I feel heard and other times I'm not. And I think for me, that's a more realistic picture of the experiences that we're having. Thank you for your contributions. I'm now going to go back to the screen. Okay. And so again, as I've said, a number of people in our research said, look, I don't feel heard. Other people said sometimes, and other people said, look, we do feel heard. And there were a myriad of factors that contributed to this. But what they told us is that, there's a host of issues, and we segmented these into two buckets. We said we've got the inward-facing factors. It's my stuff that causes me to not be heard. And then we also had the outward-facing factors. It's them, it's the system, it's the business, it's other people, etc. It's a lack of training, it's a lack of exposure, whatever the case might be. It's my culture, it's my custom, it's my tradition. And so we segmented into these two buckets. The inward-facing factors were, look, I lack confidence. I'm that person who actually I struggle with confidence, and so I wouldn't typically kind of raise my hand or contribute. I've got nervous habits. I'm unable to articulate myself clearly. Sometimes what I'm thinking in my head doesn't quite come out as I intend. And so there were all of those kinds of issues. And then the external or the outward facing factors became things like exposure to, development for communications or leadership. And then there was an interesting one that spoke to toxic company cultures, where people surfaced for us that there exists this concept called fear and silence. There are cultures where if you speak out, there's recourse, there's punishment. Where if you really speak your mind, there's an impact. You might not get that bonus. So there's recourse for showing behaviors where you're speaking up. And then others were things like home culture customs, and all kinds of biases as well. And so, what we're going to do today is we're really going to look at, so how do we close some of those gaps? And the 4 areas I wanted to cover in the presentation today is how do we embed psychological safety? And the previous speaker spoke to this, said it's one of the things that contribute to building what we call a high performance team. So what is this concept around psychological safety? And I want to make you really understand it. And then, of course, we're going to think about how do we listen through a process called constructive dialogue? How do we start to really create opportunities where people feel like somebody is truly listening to them? When I put the question forward to people, when was the last time you felt like somebody truly listened to you? I'm always astounded by how people go, actually, I can't remember. And so we're going to look at that. How do we create, environments in our workplaces where we really are learning to listen better to each other? I'm going to look at changing our narrative around conflict. This should be an interesting one. I love this idea of conflict or disagreement in spaces that are diverse. And we'll talk around how do we change our narrative around that. And finally, to say, when we bring it back to each individual here, what does it look like for you to model the behaviors that you want to see? What does it look like for you to be somebody who says, I'm going to lead by example as we cultivate cultures that are a little bit more braver? And so that's what we're going to do as we go through the session. So by way of introduction, in 2012, Google actually embarked on a project, and they called it Project Aristotle. And this project was really intended to answer the question, how do we build the best team? So Google said, we want to know how to build the best team. And so they went about studying all of the teams within sort of the organization to say, we want to get to kind of what's the formula, what's the thing that makes a team perform effectively. And so the research, uncovered a series of things. Chief amongst those was the finding that the best teams have nothing to do with who is in the team. The best teams have nothing to do with who is in the team. Typically, we have often thought that the best teams were comprised of the specialists or the really bright people, or whatever the case might be. But this research told us that it actually had nothing to do with that. And in fact, what came out from the research was that the best teams were the ones where people could be themselves. The best teams were the ones that allowed people to show up as their authentic selves, where people could contribute their thinking, where they could share their ideas, and especially when it was not comfortable to do so. To go, hey, look, I'm not sitting comfortably with this particular idea. And so another lady, Dr. Amy Edmondson, actually went on to do the research, and I think she may have been doing the research prior to Project Aristotle, but she actually then came up with a definition for this concept. And she said, psychological safety can actually be described as a shared belief amongst, members of the team that it is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. In other words, interpersonal, me, myself, how I show up. I can take a risk here. I can bring the fullness of who I am here. And I absolutely love this idea. So what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to bring this idea home for you. And a little bit earlier, Margie spoke about the fact that, our brains are designed such that we're constantly scanning the environment for threats. Our brains are constantly looking for what could be a threat in the environment and what are the ways in which I can protect or defend myself. So I want to do a little activity with you, okay? I want you to imagine that there is, you're sitting where you're sitting, and you hear a strange rustling sound where you are. And as you turn your head to the place where this strange noise is coming from, it's somewhere close to the entry, the door, you notice that there's a snake there. I want to ask you the question, what would you do? And you can use the chat function to populate your responses. If you found a snake somewhere in the vicinity of where you are, a big puff adder snake looking at you, what would you do? And I want to hear from you on the chat function. And Nico, maybe you can assist me here just by sharing what some of the inputs are.
Well, Zoya, I'll start off by saying, I would run and probably put my house up for sale, because where that snake comes from, there must be many more. Sylvia says she would faint. Usimiso says scream and run. Somebody says die, scream, run away. Okay. And somebody maybe understands the psychology of wild animals says, I would walk away calmly. Somebody says, I would look for a stick and kill it. So you get the general. Somebody says, I'll burn my house down, by the way.
Okay, so people are burning their houses down. People are looking for instruments or devices to use to kill this thing. Other people are fainting. Other people are running. What this tells us is that when we sense some kind of threat in the physical environment, without thinking, we really activate the part of our brain, the alarm center of our brain goes doot, 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 doot. You must fight, you must flight, you must freeze in order for you to avert the potential danger. This is just what we do. We do it without thinking. I always say, if I'm driving, and I know we use this example too many times, but I think it's always appropriate. If you're driving and a taxi driver, South Africans, you know this, a taxi driver swerves in front of you, you're not sitting there going, what must I do? You immediately go into that, I need to flight, I need to swerve away so that I can protect myself. So we're doing this all of the time. Now, the thing about speaking, contributing our ideas, okay, is that it is perceived by the brain as a psychological threat. And the thing about our brain is that, clever as it actually is not able to make the distinction between physical and psychological threats. In other words, if I am going to speak in a meeting, I raise my hand, I'm nervous already, and I share what I'm sharing and somebody interrupts me, it's as good as the taxi driver swerving in front of me. If I am going to say something and somebody undermines my contributions, it's as good as that snake wearing a suit. And so the brain doesn't make a distinction between the physical and the psychological threats. And that's why we've got to think about, how do we create environments where we're not having to always respond from the place of protecting or defending ourselves. This is critically important. So I'm going to give you a little tool that can assist you to know when you're actually going through this. And it's not my work. It's the work of a gentleman named Dan Siegel. And I'm going to ask you to put your hand up like this. And then I want you to take your thumb and to tuck it into sort of, take your thumb and tuck it into your hand as I'm doing. And then I want you to take the remaining 4 fingers and I want you to fold them over like this and to look at this and to go, hello, brain. Okay. So we're gonna use this, as our brain. Some of you are sitting there probably going, this is not the size of my brain. It's not. Your brain's made up of 2 hemispheres. So this would be sort of the more accurate size of what your brain looks like, and it's enclosed within the skull right here. So we're gonna use this. So what we're saying is that, this will represent the part of your brain where you make decisions, where you can think well, and we call it the prefrontal cortex. Okay, I'm giving you a little bit of technical language. It won't be, for too long. So the prefrontal cortex represents where you are doing good thinking. We also call it the executive part of your brain because this is where you are doing or making decisions. So when you woke up this morning, you were thinking about what do I wear, you were planning your day, you were operating from the prefrontal cortex, you were psychologically safe, this is where you were at. When I asked you about the snake, or when you saw the snake, your brain's alarm center, we call it the amygdala, and it sits somewhere towards the back here. You can't see with this big hair, okay? It sits somewhere towards the back of your brain, somewhere close to your neck. We call it the amygdala, the alarm center. It goes off. Doot, 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 doot. You flip your lid. So there's the alarm going off, and you activate the amygdala, the emotional part of your brain. And this is where the fight, flight, freeze often happens. And so if you think about it, you know, we're here, something happens. Doot, 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 doot. I want to fight, flight, freeze. I need to protect or defend myself. You have flipped your lid. This can become powerful as a language for you to use in your teams as you're thinking about building braver cultures. I'm about to do something here that's going to cause me to go here. I'm going to take a brave leap and it's scary for me and I recognize I'm going here. And members of your team can, through reassuring words, get you to the place where you can come back and you can do your quality thinking and make good, sound decisions. And so it's important that we get the psychological safety thing right. And so I want to introduce you to, and this isn't even my work, it's the work by a gentleman named Timothy R. Clark, and it's really beautiful. I think it's so apt for this conversation. And I'm going to speak high level to the concepts that you're seeing on screen here. So he says, you know, if we want to make practical this concept of psychological safety, because we hear it, and it's a word that sometimes can feel like it's over there. How do we really internalize it and make it something we can do something about in our respective workplaces? And so we talk about this concept of inclusion safety. And it actually is the first safety we need to make sure is in place. And, you know, we say that at the end of the day, as human beings, we actually all want to feel included. The psychology research tells us this, that one of the things we are hardwired for is a sense of belonging, that sense that I want to belong or I want to feel included. And so, you know, the first stage is really saying, how do we offer a respect for all human beings that says that everybody deserves to be included? We're living in a world where we decide, okay, this one needs to be included on the basis of having a fairer skin than another person. This one needs to be included on the basis of being taller than another person. And we've put in place all of these limitations. And we're saying this one must be excluded because they don't fit this particular grade. When we're talking about inclusion safety, it actually boils down to recognizing that people are human beings. And it becomes according them the dignity to say, Gyawubona, I see you, Sawubona. You've come into existence for me, and I've come into existence in your world. And on that basis, purely, I will include you. And so that's the first one, this idea of inclusion safety, really kind of moving beyond what we have become accustomed to around who gets included, who gets excluded, using all manner, you know, of qualifying criteria like background, sexual orientation, age, all of those kinds of things. How do we create environments where we can all feel like we belong to this organization? We belong to this team. We belong to this culture. The second one is around this concept of learner safety. And here, it really is about saying, you know, when somebody is learning something, we recognize and appreciate that there is a series of iterations they need to take. In other words, I need to do this thing a couple of times to get to the place where I have perfected it or I'm doing it, you know, in a good way. Learning implies that I will make mistakes. Learning implies that sometimes I will not know. There'll be instances where I'm not 100% sure I don't know. So learner safety says that we really have to create environments where failure isn't just accepted, where we can actually say, you know what, we failed here, but we see failure as an opportunity for growth. I'm an entrepreneur. I run a business, you heard, called Zoya Speaks. And I'm always astounded by how the South African market is just not, and I'm not going to say the African market, because in other parts of the African continent, there really is a drive to assist and to bolster entrepreneurs. But in South Africa, you know, entrepreneurs don't have the support where we can afford to fail multiple times. We go off to institutions and we typically would borrow in order to be able to, you know, build our businesses. And it's really difficult because there is a mindset in our country around how failure is not an option. And what we're saying here with that learner safety is that we've actually got to make failure something that we actually celebrate, something that we reward, because we recognize that in order to be able to get to the very best, we need sometimes to go through that process of learning and failing to get to that place. And so we want to create environments where people can make mistakes, When we have environments that don't allow this, people often feel like they need to hide their mistakes. Excuse me, I need a sip of water. I'm recovering from a nasty flu. So when we have environments where people can't learn, typically what we see is that people then want to hide their mistakes. We see cultures where people don't own up when they've made a mistake. Everyone wants to blame somebody else. So creating that learner safety allows us to make mistakes in the process and to say, what have we learned from here and how do we take it forward? Contributor safety is all about saying, let's allow people to make their contributions from a place of no judgment. Let's allow people to step in and to share their thinking, even if it is divergent. So even if it goes against kind of the status quo or what's been largely agreed, it's okay that people can show up and contribute openly and honestly. And then finally, the last one is about challenger safety. And the idea here, excuse me, and the idea here is about creating environments where we can challenge the status quo. So I've done work where we look at something called generational diversity. And you typically have what we call the baby boomers, people who've been in the organization for a very long time. And they will say things like, why must things change? I've been here for 100 years and this is how we've been doing it. And so we're saying here that there's an opportunity to say, how do we bring forward, or how do we create environments where the status quo can certainly be challenged? Because that allows us to start to move in the direction of things like innovation, creativity, thinking creatively around how we respond to the challenges that we're confronted with today. And so, one of the things I wanted to share is that, when we have psychologically safe spaces, we actually see mistakes as opportunities. We're willing to take risks and to fail. A psychologically safe environment means people speak their mind in meetings and they openly share their struggles. Somebody earlier, I think, made mention of vulnerability, and they said, we're learning that vulnerability isn't a weakness. And then, of course, you also have that trust that you're building with members of your team, as well as those who are your supervisors. Critically important. When psychological safety is in place, these are some of the features that we see. Similarly, when we don't have psychological safety, when you make a mistake, you see this as a threat to your career. I've just made a mistake. Oh my gosh. You're unwilling to rock the boat. You're not going to speak your mind. You say, you know what? I'm here to get my paycheck at the end of the month. This is what it's about. Your ideas are largely kept to yourself. We lose out on the brilliance that you could contribute. I mean, again, as somebody who coaches people around the area of leadership development and public speaking, I hear so many times people say things like, I sit in meetings and I want to share a brilliant idea. I keep my hand down and then somebody else says it. And I say, well, thank God somebody said it. At least we heard the idea. But for the most part, so many people underscore the value of their contributions. We lose out on powerful contributions that could come from you. I was running another program and I'd been with a group of graduates, and they were saying to me, the one graduate was sharing a story, in fact, where she was in a meeting and there were quite a number of seniors in the meeting with her. And she says that, the spotlight moved to her. One of the seniors said, so-and-so, what do you think? And she says she completely hit a freeze because prior to that time, she'd never been asked the question by a senior, what do you think? And so she relegated herself to the role of, I'm just a graduate here. And yet the ideas we can get from the younger generations are incredibly powerful because they're in tune with the world as it's changing, this world that we're living in. And so we really have to assist people to share their ideas. In a psychologically unsafe culture, you keep those ideas to yourself. And again, here, you only showcase your strengths. And so we never quite get a sense of, those areas that you need to improve. We never quite get a sense of the authentic version. We only see a Zoya who's only ever, doing incredibly well. We don't ever show our vulnerability. And then here, to connect to what you spoke to a little bit earlier, there's a general sense that there's fear. I fear my teammates or I fear my supervisors. It's an environment of fear. Okay. And so what we're saying here is that psychological safety and courage are simply two sides of the same coin. Both are and will continue to be needed in a complex and uncertain world. And so I really want you to think, I want you just to think for a moment about yourself and your own experiences around this concept of psychological safety. And I'm going to challenge you to say, it is easy to know when somebody else is causing us to flip our lids and to move into that place where we feel psychologically unsafe. I want to ask you, are you aware of the moments when you are that snake in a suit? And I say this with love and respect. But when you cause other people to move from here to that place where they feel the need to protect or to defend themselves, an opportunity for you to reflect on how you are standing in the way of creating a space that's psychologically safe for other people. And just a few minutes to reflect, and you can share on the chat function, or you can quietly reflect for yourself. I am going to keep it moving. And so the next concept I want to look at is a concept around constructive dialogue. And I talk about listening through constructive dialogue. Now, as a speaking coach, I often say good speakers speak well, but great speakers listen better. Good speakers can speak, but great speakers actually listen better. And I say this because, if you're listening deeply as a speaker, you listen to yourself first and foremost. So you're listening to yourself and that story that's playing in your mind. Some of the, the work that Margie covered earlier. So what's that narrative that's playing in my own mind? What's my intuition telling me in the moment? So you're listening to yourself. You're also listening to your audiences. So the people who are giving you feedback all of the time, and you're also listening to your environment. And the reason this is empowering is because it allows you to respond from a place of awareness. You're wide awake to what's happening within yourself as well as externally. And yet it's interesting how we overemphasize speaking over listening. And I'm always just, I introspect on the fact that we aren't really taught how to listen. In fact, we're often reminded of how much we don't listen. We're poor listeners. You're not listening versus thank you. I feel like you really listened to me well there. And so, one of the most powerful things I think we can start to do in our organizations is to really listen to each other. And I believe that this constructive dialogue model, this thing called constructive dialogue, can provide us with the environment to really practice this and become better listeners. So what is this thing called constructive dialogue? I think for me, it's best understood in relation to what it isn't. Dialogue is not debate. It's not debate. It's not about advancing some kind of motion and then you've got somebody who's a winner or a loser. So it's not debate. What dialogue is actually just about creating a space for people to honestly share their views without any judgment. And you do that for the purposes of creating what we call shared understanding. So, constructive dialogue is about creating a space where we can honestly share our views without judgment. And the idea or the point is so that we can get to some kind of common or shared understanding. Really about listening to the viewpoint of somebody else in a manner that builds and advances the conversation. And so the priority in dialogue is really about saying, how do I make my thoughts and my feelings visible? And then, share them with other people. And so I'm going to share, the 4 characteristics of a constructive dialogue. And, these are listening, respecting, suspending, and voicing. And I'm going to just high level talk to these. We're saying here when you listen, you do this without resistance or imposition. Somebody mentioned it as well. You're listening to understand versus to respond. There's a wonderful lady named Nancy Klein, and she wrote a book called Time to Think. I would suggest that you go and get that title for yourself. It's incredibly empowering. And she says that when we create an environment, where we listen deeply, we give people our attention, what we're actually doing is assisting them with the quality of their thinking. She says through listening, and I mean, there's a number of components that she says can help us create what she calls a thinking environment. But she says listening and giving people our quality attention is actually one of the things that causes people to do quality thinking. I can assist a person to deepen the quality of their thinking through how I listen to them. I think that's incredibly powerful. And so, let's talk a little bit about when we talk about listening, does it mean I must just kind of lean in, make eye contact? These are the things we've been told, and then nod every now and then. Is that what we're talking about when we say listen? Have you ever had the experience where you're talking to someone and they're doing all of those things? They're looking at you quite intently. They're nodding from time to time. They're even, And at some stage you pick up that, we're not in the same conversation. We're not together anymore. They're off somewhere else. So what we're saying is that, when we talk about listening, we're saying you're paying deep, genuine attention. And I like to say you do it with your eyes open and seeing. I say with your mind open and learning, and with your heart open and feeling. With your eyes open and seeing, with your mind open and learning, and your heart open and feeling. I want to put forward that these are the ways in which we can challenge ourselves to listen a little bit better. And so, we want to acknowledge what others believe and feel. And, this isn't always about saying that I necessarily agree with them, but I think it's just about allowing them room to feel like they have been understood, they have been heard. We're saying that whatever a person's views and feelings are, we're acknowledging that they are real. Constructive dialogue says your feelings and your thinking, it's real. And you're allowed to think what you think and to feel what you feel. It's such a powerful way to, to pay respect to people. Buddha says when you talk, you're only repeating what you already know, but when you listen, you may learn something new. And so that's the first one, listening. We move to the second one, respecting. And here for me, it's really about, and it's connected to what I spoke to earlier, about cultivating a belief that actually I can learn something from somebody else. It's cultivating a belief that every single person has something to teach me, actively learning from other people. So there's a tendency often to think we can teach, we're there to teach. What does it look like to go, I can learn something from the next person? I remember when we had our first child, me saying to my husband at the time, love, this child can teach us a thing or two. I feel like she'll be our greatest teacher. And I remember him looking at me like, really? This child has just come into the world. What do you mean this child can teach us a thing or two? And I think a year or a year and a half later, I remember him coming back to me to say, you said to me that this child would be our teacher, that we can learn a thing or two from this child, and I can guarantee you that this has been the experience. And so, really, when we think about the word respect, it actually is a word that comes from Latin. And it comes from the word respicere in Latin. And what this word means is like to look again, to consider, to say, what if? And so the next time you're engaging with somebody, I want you to step in with that respect, that what if this person could teach me a thing or two, and then to really think about how you're then going to listen to them, from that place. And so I actually almost want to ask the question to you, what do you think you can do more consistently in order to see the best in others and in order to be more open to what they can teach you? What can you do more consistently to see the best in others and to be more open to what they can teach you? Maybe it's to become a better listener. Maybe it's to step in with a mind of curiosity, a scout mindset. I'm curious. As we build that respectful way of engaging through dialogue. The third one is suspending. And here we're talking about our judgments, our assumptions. Really important here. I often say that we're constantly making snap judgments of people. I came onto this call, before I even opened my mouth, as I switched my camera on, you were making snap judgments. You do this unconsciously. What does it look like when we engage with people to become aware? I'm moving into that place where I'm making the judgment and to go, I'm going to suspend that and give them the opportunity to showcase who they are to me. The assumptions and the judgments that we make are really harmful in terms of, the organizations that we have. I often hear people say things like, when I looked at that person, I used to think of them in a particular way, and then I spoke to them. And then I heard their story and everything changed. And so this is what we're speaking to here, right? I think about people who are yes, but people. You speak to them and they go, yes, but. Very difficult to have a conversation with yes, but people. Are you a yes, but person? So really, it's important that we then, cultivate or build that ability to suspend our judgments and our assumptions. I often say that when we hear something that we disagree with, often we're tempted to dismiss somebody's comments or to lash out at them or even to put them, in their place. But I think what we're saying here within the context of a constructive dialogue is just resist that temptation. Don't dismiss that person. Acknowledge that that person is conveying the truth as they see it or as they feel it. And I think I always say, to my clients, I always say this, that it's worth remembering that feelings are often facts to the person who's experiencing them. Feelings are facts to the person who's experiencing them. And so just that acknowledgement, I think, goes a long way. And then finally, I think what we're saying is, speak the truth of your authority. Really be true to yourself and, share what you think and you feel. This is the fourth one, voicing. And I know that this one is easier said than done and typically requires that we become a little bit courageous. In cultures where we have fear and silence, it can become particularly daunting because it moves you from that place of safety to that place where you might have to protect or to defend yourself. But what we're saying here is that we need to think about how we voice. And so really think about when you're voicing, do you do it in ways, that invite others into the conversation? So you share your thinking and then you say something along the lines of, what are your thoughts on this? That's allowing your voicing to be open and an invitation for others to be part of the conversation. Typically, people respond very differently. Sometimes voicing is about bringing that new dimension or a new perspective to the conversation, and then assisting others to be able to see that as well. But we're saying here's an opportunity for you to speak truth to yourself, to what you think and to what you feel. So these are some of the elements that contribute to creating that safe space, really building on our listening through constructive dialogue. And so what I do want to say at this point is that, when we discourage open dialogue, we can create something called blind obedience. When we don't encourage or when we discourage open dialogue, we can create blind obedience. And I made mention of this concept of, cultures of fear and silence, and those are constructed when we know that in order for me to survive in this company, I've got to keep quiet. Or if I raise my voice and I get disturbed and people don't give me the opportunity to share what I think, those are the ways that we start to unconsciously create cultures that then, become cultures of silence or cultures of fear. If we create cultures where remaining silent about issues is the way for me to stay psychologically safe, then that's what the culture sustains. The culture sustains that silence as a method of survival in the organization. So it is in our behaviors, it's in the things we say, it's in the behaviors, the actions that we're taking. It's in those small things that may sometimes go unnoticed. And I'm inviting us to really say, as we build or cultivate a brave culture, we need to start thinking about how are we showing up? How are we behaving every day? What are the things that we're saying to each other in the corridors? Within the context of our teams, what are the things that we're not saying, that we're burying deep within, but that impact how we then show up or behave? And so, these are the things that we really need to think about. And so, ladies and gents, I really want us to think about ways in which we can start to use constructive dialogue as a means to build that braver culture. I want to move to the next one. And this one is around changing our narrative around conflict. And this is critically important. I remember when I finally said yes to my husband, it was because I'd realized that we had cultivated the art of arguing really well. We knew how to argue well. And this was one of the things where I said, you know what, me and this guy, we can be together forever because we've learned how to disagree in a good way. There was a time when we disagreed, it would be about, how do I reduce him to nothing because he's making me feel terrible? And similarly, he would find himself in the same place. I just want to take a sip of water. But when we learned to have, good disagreements and we're able to allow for each person to be heard, even though we didn't even end up agreeing, I knew that this was the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. So, I love this quote by Patrick Lencioni. He says, great relationships are built on the ability to argue. Great relationships are built on the ability to argue. And yet, I think when we think of conflict or arguing, we often see it as something to avoid. want to run away from having a conflict. And I think the word conflict can be quite harsh. And so I'm saying that having an argument, excuse me, oh, I'm really sorry. I'm recovering from a bad bout of flu. So I'm saying that having an argument can be productive because it says that we are diverse. So we may see things from completely different perspectives, and that's okay. And so when we look at the diversity element of the picture, if we think about our organizations or our teams, how do we leverage that diversity? Sometimes it'll be to hear something I don't want to hear. Sometimes it'll be listening to a perspective that's completely out of my range. Ooh. Oh, give me a second there.
All right. Yeah, while we give you a second, Zoya, maybe I'll also just read, just some of the impressions that are coming through. And I think literally what you're saying is hitting the nail. What is it? The nail on the head. There's someone here who was responding to that element of, active listening. So Ferguson says active listening versus just the impression of exactly what you were saying. So listening and checking in with the person to make sure that the understanding is the same, that you're both on the same page as well. But I think another very interesting one as well is this whole element of, I suppose, what we are calling conflict, that sometimes conflict might not necessarily be a bad thing, but I suppose it is the art of how you enter into conflict that then determines what the outcome then is. And of course, I mean, if we look at our workspaces, diverse views, opinions, you name it, there, it can't always be kumbaya, so to speak. There will be those instances where heads butt, but what do we then do to make that a constructive engagement? Over to you. You ready, Zoya?
Oh, thank you so much. I needed
Sorry
to
about
step
that.
in there. I had a bit of like a coughing fit, it just wouldn't stop. And I think it's because I was able to carry it. And eventually it erupted. And I think it's apt because we're going to talk about that shortly. So I wanted to share just, again, something just to assist our thinking. I know some people work better with pictures than words. And, this is something called the conflict continuum. And of course, if you're looking at this, what you see is on the one hand of this continuum, we see kind of harmony. And on the other hand, we see personal attacks. And in fact, that harmony is not right. It should say artificial harmony. So artificial harmony on the one side, and on the other side, we have what we call personal attacks. So, artificial harmony, as the name implies, is a space where people in a team never disagree. We never engage in conflict when we're sitting, on the artificial harmony side of this conflict continuum. We're always kind of nice to each other, even if we don't feel like it. We kind of are nice. We're very polite to each other. And if you look on the opposite end, when we're talking about ugly, or, we're talking about kind of personal attacks, that very negative type of conflict, this is where it becomes quite ugly. And in fact, sometimes it goes as far as to become personal, can be mean-spirited and personal. And, here people are at each other's throats. Things often get out of control. We're exploding here. It's like that pot, that's bubbling, and that eventually explodes. And so here, this is because we have been sitting. So we get often to this part, the personal attacks, the ill-spirited type of conflict, when we sit at the artificial harmony space for too long. And typically we're brushing things under the carpet. And so we're saying that what we actually want to do is no longer to brush things under the carpet. We want to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. With sometimes saying that in the midst of our diversity, inclusion will look like hearing the thing we don't want to hear. And so if we come back to this, conflict continuum, it would look like moving along the continuum, through that constructive space. So we're moving, alongside this continuum from this place of artificial harmony, and we're going here and we're saying, what does it look like to be able to say we create room for people to disagree here, because we recognize that it assists us to grow as a team or as an organization. And I'm going to call that generative conflict. So we're able to generate something positive through this, through disagreeing, through having this conflict. And so what we want to do is really to move along this continuum. Now, what happens sometimes is we're moving along this continuum and we get to the place where, we get to sort of the middle here. Okay, and this is where constructive dialogue actually sits in the middle, somewhere between constructive and destructive. And as teams, because we're people, sometimes we cross over and we move into that destructive space. I want to put it that in a psychologically safe team, we can actually move from destructive and go back to that constructive space because safety is intact and people can go, hold on. We just recognize that we've gone to that place where it's become a little bit nasty. I've just recognized that we've lost sight of what the actual issue is, and now we're pointing fingers and blaming each other. Psychological safety will enable us to pick up when we've crossed over to the destructive space where it's no longer productive, where it's no longer generative. And so I really want us to start to rethink this concept of conflict and to see it as something that can assist us to grow. But to the point Nico has made, and I'm sure to the contributions you are sharing on the chat, it becomes about, so how do we do this? How do we engage in conflict in ways that allow us to make it productive and generative? If we're building braver cultures, we must allow room for us to disagree and to do that openly and to do that without fear. To really get to the place where we say diversity means that we're not always going to agree here. But what diversity gives us is the opportunity to really move to a place where we can collaborate and become innovative because we're leveraging different ideas, different ways of doing, different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing the same picture. And the conflict continues. Of an interaction where I was facilitating a senior leadership strategy session. And we were gathered in this boardroom. And I remember that this team had been struggling with all kinds of things. And at some point, this impacted on their bottom line. And so they call in consultants, they call in people like us. And this was after COVID, and the company was really struggling. And so we were sitting in the session, and one of the things we did was just to ask everybody to do like a 360 feedback thing. So everybody had an opportunity to go to their colleagues and, get some feedback, etc. Anyway, the long and short is that we were sitting and we were going through what had been uncovered or surfaced in the feedback. And we were doing this for the big dog, the big senior in the room. And it was so interesting because one of the things that was picked up is that this senior leader was really poor at giving people feedback, and particularly the kind of feedback that allowed them to grow. And when we asked people the question, so who gave this feedback? Unsurprisingly, no one owned up to having given that feedback. And that was incredibly funny because we said, well, everybody contributed to filling out this form. Everybody gave this feedback. There's somebody in this room who said, this leader does not give feedback in ways that affirm me. And yet nobody could speak up. And, I saw hesitation as one of the people in the room, and I don't even want to get too specific, but one of the leaders in the room actually wanted to contribute, but I could see they were second guessing themselves. Do I do this? Do I not? What is recourse if I own up that I'm actually the person who did this? And ultimately, you know, we had to have a tough conversation with the leader to say, what's the environment you've created here, where people can't speak up openly and honestly about their experiences of you as the leader? And it was tough. And eventually we were able to do the work, and, you know, things started to change, but that leader had to go back and do some deep digging on the ways in which he had created an environment where his team members showed up in a particular way. And of course, this was cascaded into the rest of the organization. So, you know, what does it look like for us to really take this, internalize it, and say, how do I do this as a leader? How do I take this for myself and really show up in ways where I lead by example, cognizant of the culture that we're trying to create? A brave culture will require that as leaders, you know, we're brave as well. I wanted to end off with this wonderful video. And Nico, just confirm for me if the sound is good. I have enabled sound on my side, but just give me that thumbs up. And then I'll come back and we'll close it out very nicely.
This is a day I've been looking for.
I don't know what happened there.
No, this is wrong. Oh my God, look at what you're doing.
And so I really think that we're being challenged here. I'm going to stop the share quickly. You know, as we come to the end of this presentation, I really think we're being challenged, you know, around the role that we must play as we think about creating cultures that are a little bit braver. A lot of what I said, or some of what I have shared today, might be terra incognita to some of you, incognito to some of you. It might be territory unknown. But I think here, you know, we have an opportunity to say, how do we start to explore that unknown territory, recognizing that it's not necessarily going to be easy? How do we become deliberate to challenge that which we know and have been doing for a better way? How do we become deliberate to challenge that which we know and may have been doing, for ways that look a little bit better? I say to dare to be brave is both exciting and scary, but I think the risks associated with not taking that plunge are so much more scarier. We're living in a world that's calling on us to really dig deep on our humanity and to see people. Again, the gift of COVID, I think for me, has really been to say, how do we ensure that our greatest asset, the human resource, the human capital, is seen and appreciated for who they are and the value that they bring? And one of the ways to do that is to liberate their voices, to see them, to hear them, to value them. And so I wish you everything of the best on your respective culture transformation journeys. I really hope that what we've shared today has landed in your headspace or in your heart space, and that some of the nuggets you can certainly take back into your respective organizations. Thank you so much. Back to you, Nico.
Thank you very much, Zoya. Zoya speaks, you have absolutely spoken. And I think really, what you've shared has been so insightful. And I have no doubt that each of us that are participating here this morning/afternoon have taken nuggets that will really assist us introspect. How do we show up in those spaces, either in a way that inhibits, the burgeoning of braver cultures, or how do we show up in spaces that are conducive for those braver cultures? And I always find this so important when we have these discussions as well. And I think you should, in one of your earlier slides, then, because there's an element of what can organizations do to create that space and environment. But oftentimes we forget that organizations, like institutions, are but buildings. The people inside of those entities make up the organization. They make up that culture. They provide a scent for what that organization is like. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to ask everybody, please turn your cameras on. Of course, mic's muted, and we're going to give almost like an air applause to Zoya to say thank you so much. We really appreciate. So a couple of seconds. I don't know if Mayno, you can help us activate that functionality for people to be able to switch on their cameras, just for us to show appreciation to Zoya for really an insightful presentation. I see there. Thank you very much. I see you. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zoya, for that. So without wasting any time, I'm going to jump straight into our discussion and questions. And of course, people in the chat have been sharing their impressions. A lot of nuggets have landed. People are saying, goodness, I'm taking this on. Powerful, impactful. I'm seeing Ashani saying, thank you so much, Zoya. Very inspired and learned a lot. And that really is the purpose of these sessions. We cannot walk out of the session the same way we were at 8:45. Otherwise, I think this has been a waste of a day. But generally, we have learned a lot. Zoya, you started by saying, well, amongst many other things, but another thing that stood out for me is to try and explain, when you explain what building that braver culture looks like. You said it's about forging new paths, entering new territories, but also how do we then make our workspaces enable people to forge those new territories or enter into those new paths. And then in that survey that you ran, very interesting, because from the first part, people, an overwhelming majority, answered yes at saying we want to be heard. Then on the second question of do you feel that you are heard, huge disjuncture. And I think you spent the great majority of your presentation saying, how do we bridge that gap and that disjuncture? Saying, how do we look at, creating a safety net for people to feel free to be able to contribute, to speak, and to be heard. But also very importantly was an element of constructive dialogue. How do we make sure that even though when someone speaks, it's not just, passing over, but that they are heard, their views are taken into account, but also changing the narrative around conflict and the art of how do we conflict. I'm going to make that into a verb, how do we do that? But also modeling the right behaviors. So I've got a question actually here's where that comes from timber. So maybe let's give a scenario. I am a graduate, I'm an intern, and maybe I'm a junior member of staff. I'm sitting in a boardroom. Somebody asks me, what do I think, or asks me to contribute. Now, probably I've been in a shell for the longest time. I'm not used to speaking out in these corporate spaces. But now, how do I then deal with the fear of even just beyond me speaking out, but dismissive leadership? That, okay, I can speak, but I always know when I speak, I'll be dismissed. How do you sort of, approach it? How do you deal with dismissive leadership in the face of wanting to build a safe space for people to speak out?
Sure, that's a big question, because I could offer an easy, do the work on yourself, you have value to contribute. But to do that in the face of perpetually dismissive leadership becomes challenging, because what we're saying there is that ultimately what gets created is a culture where people say, when I take that risk of speaking out, I am going to be dismissed. I mentioned a lady named Nancy Klein, and I said Nancy Klein talks about creating, an environment where people can do quality thinking. One of the things she says is that when we interrupt people or dismiss people when they're engaging, it literally is equivalent to punching somebody in the face. That's what interruption does. And so for me, I would want to address the issue around these dismissive cultures. And I think that's why we're gathered here today, to say to our leaders, we really need to rethink how we do meetings. And that's where I'm going to start. Leaders need to rethink the things that they're doing unconsciously that are causing people to opt for silence, because I'm going to get dismissed or I'm going to get interrupted. The brain registers an interruption in the same way as it would a punch to the face. But if I then come back to the question around that person who says, I'm sitting in that room and I want to contribute and I'm feeling a bit nervous, and there's those feelings of fear. One of the things that I teach people to do is to cultivate something called power presence. And I say, if you were to stand outside of a room and look at that room, right, and it's an empty space, let's imagine it's an empty room, it doesn't have you in it. When you step into that room, by virtue of being a human being who is alive, who is breathing, etc., there's an energy you bring into that space. Too many of us are stepping into rooms and we aren't even conscious of kind of having stepped into, I'm not even aware that I've come into a room. And so how do you cultivate your power presence? You become mindful about, when you step into the room, what are you committing to bring into that space? So I'm somebody who's quite energetic. I want to give an example. I'm quite energetic and I like to make people think. When I step into a room, I'm bringing a certain energy into this room. I'm bringing into this room a curious mindset, because I love to think and I love to find out what other people think. So that's the second one. Cultivate that presence and really become mindful that something can change because you've stepped into the room. And then finally, to say, as you're raising your hand and as you're about to make that contribution, call to mind the version of yourself that was not afraid. There was a time when a version of yourself showed up anyway, unafraid. It may have been a 4-year-old version of yourself. It may have been a 6-year-old version of yourself that stepped into spaces and said, I'm just here to be who I am. And to say, I'm stepping into that space, I'm going to call to mind that younger version of myself, and then I'm going to tell myself the narrative, I am here to contribute value. I have something of value to contribute. And so those are some of the things that I offer to the person who says, I'm standing or I'm sitting in that place, I want to offer my contributions. Think of that version of yourself before the fear hit you, before all of those agreements were put in place to make you smaller, to shrink you, to make you somebody who others will accept. What was that version of yourself that was unafraid? And it's often a smaller version. And then finally, interrogate that narrative in your mind. What's the story I'm telling myself right now? And change it to one that's affirming. And often I say, I'm here to add value. And because of that, I'm going to raise my voice.
No, fantastic. I love, Zoe, when you say, defer to that version of yourself, most probably a younger version that could show up braver into these spaces. And of course, that's not to say it's the easiest thing to be done, but it's something that is worth a try, that you build up on and you build up on, consistently as well. And as well on the chat, just going through it, Zoya, an outpouring of great appreciation for your presentation. People say, you know what, you've touched my heartstrings. I've learned so much. I'm not walking out here the same as I was, prior to the start of the session. So just appreciation that you need to know, Zoya, and all of the love that is being shared for you here as well. Another question, Zoya, when we're speaking about conflict, interesting one. And I think I keep on harping on that because oftentimes people sometimes don't speak up, not because they agree with what is being said. You know, oftentimes there's this really popular saying, which is not true at all, where they say silence means consent. And I think that could not be further from the truth at all. But when it comes to, you know, conflict and respectfully disagreeing, how would you advise someone to do it? Whether it is, I think if it's colleagues on the same level, it's much easier. But say maybe it is a superior. How do you respectfully disagree, Zoya?
So one of the things I want to offer is this. Be very aware. I gave you this language because I want you to really use it and apply it. Be aware of, as you're about to enter the conflict, am I here at a place where I can make a sound decision? I can make good decisions, or am I here where I'm going to shoot from that place to defend or to protect myself? That's the first thing. Have a sense of, where am I engaging? What's the place from where I engage, where I'm going to engage in this conflict from? That's most important. If you're engaging from here, it's going to be heated. It's going to be very emotional. It's going to be very subjective because you're trying to protect. I'm operating from that place where my survival has been threatened and I'm fighting, or I'm flighting, or I'm freezing. That's the first thing. The second thing is to say, then do the work of saying, how can I then, get back to that place where I can, engage in the conflict from a place where I can do sound or quality decision making. Okay. And sometimes it's just taking a couple of deep breaths in. I kid you not. In that moment, going, okay, just breathe. And you find yourself literally kind of self-regulating and arriving back at this place. The third thing is to say, now that you're here, resist the temptation to engage in the conflict from the place of what you think or what you feel. Start from the place of the fact. And I often say here, imagine that there was like a video recorder in the room. So if there was a video recorder, what's the thing the video recorder would have picked up? What's the factual part of this entire thing? What did you observe? What did you hear? What did you read? That's the factual thing. Versus I'm thinking a particular thing. I often say that when you, and I'm going to make an example just to make it easy. When you're thinking something, it often is informed by a factual experience that you had. There's some kind of raw data that you experience that has led you to think a particular thing. So let's make an example. I stepped into this session and I am wearing a big afro. Okay. So you see that that's a fact. You saw that Zoya's got a big afro. Okay. The story that can start to play out is, I think she is, I don't know, somebody who likes things. That's in your thinking. She's somebody who likes things because she's wearing this big afro. Okay. I feel curious. I'd like to get to know her, right? Because she's somebody who likes things. You then move into that feeling space. And so if we can start to approach our conversations in that way, it becomes a little bit different because you're owning that your thinking and your feeling is yours. And that it happened because there was some kind of raw data that we started with. Let's bring it back into the workspace. Somebody arrives late for a meeting. The fact is that I saw them come in late for that meeting. I can start to create a whole lot of stories. I think that they don't care about our team and the objectives that we need to achieve, and I feel quite irritated by their behavior. When we engage with that person, we might discover that our thinking, whilst it's absolutely, it's my thinking, is wrong. That person it's not about the team. That person just had a challenge with their baby in the morning. Do I still need to feel frustrated if I know that it wasn't about her not giving, the team what the team deserves? She was just dealing with a personal issue. And so when we start from that place of fact and then follow that with, as a result of the factual thing I'm observing or seeing, seeing or hearing or whatever the case is, this is the story I start to create in my head. This is how it makes me feel. It really becomes a beautiful way to engage in what would otherwise be a destructive conflict situation and to make it something that's productive. So that's what I would offer there.
Wow. Thank you so much, yeah, for that. And I think, often what you're saying for the most part, and I think it even echoes, on from the first session as well, that oftentimes I'm going to say we show up based on the stories and the narratives we create in our heads. And sometimes that becomes the basis that can lead to a conflict, unwittingly so as well. So maybe just to do that work. And I really loved it when you said perhaps sometimes it's either you're approaching a situation from this kind of perspective or from this kind of perspective. So check yourself and try and be aware of where you are in that moment and how do you bring yourself back, because then that already, I suppose, diffuses any kind of conflict that could then arise as well. So check ourselves before then entering into that. But I also suppose entering into discussions or debates, not from I want to come out right because I am right, and that so not presupposing what the end of that discussion ought to be as well. So I'm going to read some of the comments coming up in our chat. Please feel free to respond. I'll just take a few. I'm just going to go all the way up. We've got Ashmira who then says, so of course everybody's opining on the different elements that you've spoken about over the last hour. So Ashmira says, and also how you speak about how we feel and not feel bad or feel that we are wrong in expressing ourselves. So perhaps if I come into a space, I ought not to feel bad for the opinion that I harbor or how I feel coming into that space. And I think it's part of creating that safety net as well. Of course, we've got people that are absolutely brilliant, Zoya. Thank you very much. Learned a lot. Then we've got Togozile who says that one of the most difficult aspects of leadership is lowering the waterline and showing more than the tip of the iceberg, being transparent, vulnerable, and open with your team. And I think then this speaks to that element where you spoke about how do you lead, how do you model the right behavior as a leader as well.
Can I come in?
Yes, come in, Zoya. Yeah.
So I mean, I want us to, and I'm going to use the Titanic as an example, just because I think it's a metaphor or a story that we all know. So if you've ever watched the Titanic, there's a point in the film where, I don't know if it's Rose or, one of the characters spots, oh, they see something over there in the distance. And I think that's the iceberg, or, it could be one of the sort of cabin crew. They do see the iceberg from a mile, okay? But they decide to continue going. So they're seeing what we call the tip of the iceberg, the top part of the iceberg, okay? And they decide to keep going. And at some point, we know that the Titanic hits the iceberg, the ship sinks, etc. We know that story. Now, if we take this into who we are, typically how we show up as people is literally by showcasing only the tip of that iceberg. That's what we do. We showcase kind of just, what's acceptable to show, the tip of that iceberg, the top of the iceberg. But oftentimes when we collide or when we connect, it's not at the top, it's at the bottom of the iceberg. When we do the work of sharing our stories, going a little bit beneath the iceberg, we're creating opportunities for deep and meaningful connections to happen with people. I don't collide with somebody at the top of the iceberg. I collide with them at the bottom of that iceberg when they're touching on my beliefs, my value systems, the core of who I am. And so that's why it becomes important to say, I'm willing to do the work of going a little bit deeper, because I recognize that when I share those parts of myself, I'm also allowing myself to connect deeper, or to connect with the person at their deeper level as well. It's so important. It's not easy work, and I want to acknowledge that it's not easy. And particularly because we've been told, protect yourself, only show them this part of who you are. The rewards of engaging with people at that vulnerable place cannot be counted. I've had experiences where I've showed up so vulnerably, and afterwards people say my life changed, something shifted, because I recognized what you shared in myself. And so to always encourage us, I think, to try to say it's a work in progress. I mean, I don't take it for granted that this is not easy work. It's courageous work. And I think, again, part of what we're speaking to here is that when we talk about being brave, we're leaning deep into that courageous space whose rewards cannot be counted.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think what you're saying, I want to read maybe the last two comments here, just to really, round and summarize things off. So Ashmira says, absolute value to my day and days ahead. Thank you for sharing your journey. This is where we talk about that authentic self, showing up as the authentic self, Zoya, and also making us look at the little things that we can change that will make a greater change and greater difference. And I really love how this message is put. You know, at the beginning, I said we have every year these dive-in festivals, incredible 3 days of discussion, but it ought not to end there. The idea is that these sessions really, you know, pique our thinking, our interest, and actually, I would say, even harass us to do more in our spaces. And I'm hoping really that this conversation that we've had, buttressed by the one that we had before as well, really sets us as individuals, as people working in these institutions, to say, what can we do on a day-to-day basis? It's not easy work, like you said. It's not an overnight, it's not overnight, but it is, you know, being really conscious of the work that needs to be done, and then systematically putting those things in place that will enable us, when we meet again next year at this time, the need has shifted. We have moved. Perhaps we can take on another topic, but something must have shifted and something must have changed. We've got Judy says, wow, I was blown away, such an informative session, but it's really all echoing the very same sentiments that here we have learned a great deal. We've learned a lot. So thank you so much, Zoya. I think we could go on and talk. Oh my goodness, I see Ashmira is really, she doesn't want me to close. She's just saying something else as well. She says, you know, she says, you're giving a part of yourself to others, knowing you can be hurt, but trusting each other to create that deeper connection. And I believe it's within teams where you've got that sense of connection and authenticity that can enable the diversity of views to come across. And I suppose all for the greater good. We all work for these organizations because we are chasing something. There's a vision that we are all after. So we need to create that conducive environment that allows the greatest scale of inclusion as possible for us to get there. So Zoya speaks. Thank you so much. Absolutely invaluable. So now we're going to head off to a close as well. So in fact, before maybe I stop, are there any last words, anything you'd like to say, a parting shot before I go to housekeeping and closing of the session?
I think it's just to say, you know, we all have something of value to contribute. And I just want us to own that. And when we own that, we start to be able to, you know, see that in others. When I know I have value to contribute, I create the psychologically safe spaces that allow others to contribute their value. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful opportunity.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Zoya Mabuto-Mokoditoa. He did tell me that this is a mouthful, and I've been practicing since yesterday. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You know, ladies and gentlemen, this has been an incredible, almost 3 hours actually of discussion, and I really can't believe how the time has flown. I think if we had a whole day or half a session, I think we still wouldn't be able to exhaust just the amounts of discussion topics and areas that we could cover. I mean, we started off the morning with Dr. Margie Warrell, who spoke about, you know, building that culture of courage, saying, why is courage important, you know? And she used the analogy, you know, courage is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the more you train it, the greater bounds of it that you have, I suppose. But she also touched on a few aspects as well. That, you know, as leaders leading these organizations, we need to lead from the why perspective. So what's driving us to do what we do, but also perhaps from a point of courage and leading from what is possible, inventing those kinds of futures and daring to dream and guiding and encouraging our teams from that point of view as well. And I think that really sets such a good foundation for our second speaker as well, who then came on to then say, yes, we've spoken about the element of being courageous and being brave, but what does that look like in the context of our voices being heard in these organizations? What does it look like to create these safe spaces where people can come in, contribute for the greater part, you know, for the greater good of the team rather? So I think really it is not an exaggeration when I say that all of us have benefited and learned a great deal. So if you do feel like you want to go back to the session, you want to share the session, I'm happy to report that this session will be uploaded on YouTube. I believe that Charlene will share the link in due course, or you can also also just reach out to her. I believe that everybody on this session might have her contact details or know how to get into contact with her as well. So I want to really thank our speakers, thank Margie, thank Zoya. Thank you so much, ladies, for an insightful session, but also not forgetting the 5 companies that have really banded together to bring us yet another edition of the Dive In Festival. So once again, AIG, Aon, Marsh, Chubb, and I2, big thank you. We look forward to next year's edition, which we believe really we build from strength to strength, which will be even bigger, and we're looking forward to that indeed. Now, you know, putting together an event such as this is no easy feat, whether it's online or whether it is a physical engagement. So I want to say a very big thank you as well to the technical team, the people behind making this happen. And I want to say thank you very much to them as well. Thank you very much, Charlene, for all of the running around that you've been doing, the coordinating to make sure that all of us can be gathered here this morning. Also, I may know all the way from the US, it's very early. You were up, not even at the crack of dawn, much earlier than that. Thank you so much for really being the technical support behind this, making this possible. An absolute thank you. And of course, to you, our audience, our participants, this would not have been possible without you. Otherwise, we'd just be speaking to ourselves, and that is not good at all. So I want to actually ask, before I say goodbye, can we all switch on our cameras so that I can say goodbye to faces one last time? So Mayno, one last time, if you're still there, please enable it. I want to see faces. I want to say goodbye to faces as all. So thank you so much to the audience. You have been absolutely phenomenal. Thank you for being so engaging on the chat, putting in your questions, your impressions. It really does encourage the people on the other side of the camera to just keep on going. So for myself, Niko Koza, thank you so much. I do look forward again to next year's edition. Thank you and goodbye.